You think poor families just suffered through hard times with nothing but grit and prayer? Think again. From makeshift cleaning solutions to ingenious repair tricks, resourceful households developed strange but effective methods that kept homes running when money ran out. Here are 30 strange household tricks that only poor families knew. Newspaper insulation stuffed into walls and under floorboards was one of the most common tricks poor families used to survive brutal winters without proper heating. Families collected old newspapers for months, crumpling and layering them into gaps between walls, under drafty doors, and around window frames to block cold air. The paper created pockets of trapped air that acted as genuine insulation, reducing heat loss in homes with single-pane windows and thin wooden walls. Children were often sent to neighbors or stores to gather discarded papers, understanding that their collection meant warmer nights. The rustling sound of newspaper settling became familiar, a quiet reminder of resourcefulness born from necessity. This wasn't just about comfort, but survival, as heating fuel cost money families simply didn't have. Many homes used this technique well into the 1970s because they trusted what worked. Vinegar and water cleaning solutions replaced expensive store-bought products in households where every penny mattered and nothing could be wasted on luxuries like brand-name cleaners. Mothers kept large jugs of white vinegar under the sink, diluting it with water to create an all-purpose cleaner that tackled windows, floors, counters, and bathroom tiles. The sharp smell of vinegar meant the house was being cleaned, and children grew up associating that scent with Saturday chores and pride in a sparkling home. Vinegar cut through grease, dissolved mineral deposits from hard water, and left surfaces streak-free without harsh chemicals. Families discovered it also worked as a fabric softener, a drain cleaner when combined with baking soda, and even a remedy for sunburns. This single ingredient stretched budgets remarkably, proving that expensive didn't mean effective. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter, becoming family tradition as much as survival strategy. Lard saved from cooking was never discarded, but stored in old coffee cans and repurposed for everything from seasoning cast iron skillets to moisturizing cracked winter skin. Poor families understood that rendered fat from bacon, pork chops, and roasted meats was liquid gold that shouldn't go down the drain. The lard was strained through cheesecloth to remove food particles, then stored in cool pantries where it solidified into clean white fat ready for countless uses. Women rubbed it on their hands after washing dishes in harsh water, smoothed it on children's chapped lips during cold months, and even used it to condition leather boots and saddles. The fat also worked as a lubricant for squeaky hinges, stuck zippers, and stubborn drawer slides. Nothing went to waste in these kitchens, and the coffee can of lard became as essential as salt and flour. This practice connected families to older generations who understood that survival meant finding multiple uses for every single resource available. Flour sack fabric transformed into clothing, curtains, and household linens was one of the most creative survival strategies poor families employed during lean decades. Flour and feed companies eventually caught on and began printing their sacks with colorful patterns, knowing mothers would choose prettier fabrics when possible. Women would carefully open the sacks, wash out the flour residue, and iron the fabric smooth before cutting and sewing it into dresses, aprons, dish towels, and underwear for their children. The fabric was surprisingly soft and durable, standing up to countless washings and years of use. Children often wore matching outfits made from the same flour sacks, and neighbors could identify which store a family shopped at based on the patterns. This practice required skill, patience, and the understanding that pride didn't come from store-bought clothes, but from making something beautiful from nothing. Flour sack dresses became symbols of both poverty and incredible resourcefulness. Cardboard shoe insoles cut from cereal boxes replaced worn-out soles in shoes that couldn't be afforded to replace or repair professionally. Children would stand on flattened cardboard while parents traced around their feet, cutting out insoles that fit perfectly inside worn shoes. The cardboard provided cushioning and protection from the ground, extending the life of shoes that had holes worn straight through the original soles. Families kept stacks of cereal boxes and shoe boxes specifically for this purpose, understanding that a good pair of shoes had to last until they literally fell apart. The insoles needed replacing frequently, especially during rainy seasons when they would get soggy and break down. But the materials were always free. Children learned to check their shoes each morning, swapping out damp cardboard for dry pieces before heading to school. This simple trick kept kids walking comfortably when new shoes simply weren't possible, teaching them that problems always had solutions if you looked hard enough. Coffee grounds, dried and reused for multiple pots, stretched precious coffee supplies in households where the morning cup was considered essential fuel for hard labor. Families would spread used grounds on newspaper to dry in the sun or near the wood stove, then store them for mixing with fresh grounds the next morning. A half-and-half mixture of fresh and dried grounds produced coffee that was weaker but still drinkable, effectively doubling how long a can of coffee lasted. Some families reused grounds up to 3 times, accepting increasingly thin coffee rather than going without entirely. The practice required timing and attention because grounds left too long would mold, wasting the entire batch. Men heading to factory jobs and women facing long days of household work needed their coffee, and this trick ensured they got it. The knowledge of exactly how many times grounds could be reused became household wisdom passed between neighbors and family members. Bacon grease saved in jars on the stovetop served as the primary cooking fat in poor households where butter and vegetable oil were expensive luxuries reserved for special occasions. Every time bacon was fried, the rendered fat was carefully strained and poured into a designated jar that sat permanently on the back of the stove. This grease was used for frying eggs, sautéing vegetables, seasoning beans, and adding flavor to cornbread batter. The fat never went rancid because it was used and replenished so frequently, cycling through the kitchen in constant rotation. Children grew up thinking all food was supposed to taste slightly of bacon because that flavor touched nearly everything they ate. The jar became a fixture as essential as salt and pepper, its level rising and falling with the family's cooking rhythms. Bacon grease represented both thrift and flavor, proving that poverty didn't have to mean bland, tasteless food. Bread bag ties and twist ties collected in junk drawers served countless purposes in households where nothing was ever thrown away if it might possibly prove useful later. These small metal or plastic-coated wires became tools for organizing electrical cords, closing bags of frozen vegetables, securing tomato plants to stakes in the garden, and even repairing broken zipper pulls on jackets. Families accumulated dozens over months and years, storing them in old coffee cans, jelly jars, or dedicated junk drawer compartments where they tangled together waiting for their moment. The ties were perfect for quick fixes that didn't warrant a trip to the hardware store, and children learned to check the collection before asking parents to buy anything. Organizing Christmas lights, bundling newspapers for recycling, and marking keys all became easier with a handful of bread ties. This tiny act of saving and reusing represented the larger philosophy that governed poor households where waste was unthinkable. Egg cartons repurposed into seed starters turned trash into gardening tools for families who grew their own vegetables to survive. The individual compartments were perfect for starting tomato, pepper, and flower seeds indoors before transplanting them to the garden once weather warmed. Mothers would fill each cell with soil, plant a seed or two, and water carefully until tiny sprouts emerged. The cardboard cartons held moisture well and could be torn apart for individual transplanting, with the cardboard decomposing naturally in the soil. Families who kept chickens had endless supplies of cartons, while others collected them from neighbors or even asked grocery stores for damaged ones. The practice connected generations who understood that gardens meant food security and that every resource had potential beyond its original purpose. Children learned patience watching seeds sprout in kitchen windows, understanding that food came from effort and planning, not just store shelves. Soap slivers pressed together into new bars prevented waste in households where every purchase had to stretch as far as humanly possible. As bars of soap wore down to thin slivers too small to use comfortably, families would collect them in dishes until enough accumulated for recombining. The slivers were wet thoroughly, pressed firmly together, and left to dry into a single misshapen but functional bar. Some families used a double boiler to melt the pieces together into molds, creating smoother bars that looked almost store-bought. Children often got the job of pressing slivers together, their small hands perfect for molding the soap while it was still soft. The practice meant a household might go months longer between soap purchases, significant savings for families counting every penny. This simple trick taught children that waste was shameful and that ingenuity could solve problems that money couldn't. Rubber bands saved from newspapers and produce became essential repair tools in households where buying new supplies meant choosing between fixing something or feeding someone. Families wrapped them around loose jar lids to improve grip, bundled pencils and utensils together, and used them to hold cracked tool handles in place until proper repairs could be made. The bands accumulated in kitchen drawers, sorted loosely by size, ready for whatever emergency arose next. Children learned to slip them off rolled newspapers carefully to avoid snapping, understanding that even this small item had value. Stretched rubber bands became slingshots for boys, hair ties for girls, and game pieces for indoor entertainment on rainy days. When wrapped tightly around leaking hose connections, they provided temporary fixes that often became permanent solutions. The elasticity eventually gave out, but new bands arrived with the next newspaper delivery, keeping the supply constantly replenished. Potato water saved from boiling became a secret ingredient for bread baking and plant fertilizer in kitchens where waste was considered almost sinful. The starchy water left behind after cooking potatoes contained nutrients and natural starches that made bread dough rise higher and stay softer longer. Women would let the water cool, then use it in place of plain water when mixing bread dough, creating loaves with better texture and longer freshness. The remaining potato water went to houseplants and garden vegetables, providing nutrients that helped them thrive without expensive commercial fertilizers. Families understood that this cloudy water held value invisible to those who simply poured it down the drain. Children watched their mothers carefully strain potatoes over bowls rather than sinks, learning that thoughtfulness in small moments added up to significant savings. This practice connected everyday cooking to broader household economy, demonstrating how attention and intention could transform waste into resource. Candle stubs melted together created new candles in homes where light after dark was necessity rather than luxury, and store-bought candles strained tight budgets. Families saved every candle stub, storing them in coffee cans until enough accumulated for melting. The wax was heated in double boilers or old tin cans set in pots of water, then poured into molds made from milk cartons, jelly jars, or even hollowed-out orange peels. Wicks came from cotton string or strips of old fabric twisted tight. The resulting candles burned unevenly and sometimes smoked more than store-bought ones, but they provided light when needed. Children often helped with the melting process, watching colored waxes swirl together into new patterns. The practice required patience and care to avoid burns, teaching valuable lessons about heat, materials, and transformation. These homemade candles represented self-sufficiency, the understanding that light itself could be created from scraps others discarded. Baking soda paste for cleaning and deodorizing replaced countless specialty products in frugal households where one ingredient had to serve many purposes. Mixed with water into thick paste, baking soda scrubbed stains from countertops, sinks, and bathtubs without scratching surfaces. Sprinkled dry on carpets and upholstery, it absorbed odors overnight before being vacuumed away. Added to laundry, it brightened whites and softened hard water. Families kept open boxes in refrigerators and freezers to absorb food smells, replacing them monthly and using the old baking soda for cleaning. The powder also served as emergency toothpaste, antacid for upset stomachs, and treatment for bee stings and sunburns. Children grew up seeing this single orange box solve problem after problem, learning that simplicity often outperformed complexity. Baking soda represented the philosophy that knowledge mattered more than money, that understanding how things worked could replace expensive purchases with pennies worth of powder. Old sheets torn into rags served every cleaning purpose in homes where paper towels were considered wasteful extravagance that poor families couldn't justify. When sheets wore thin in the center from years of sleeping, they were cut into squares and rectangles of various sizes, then stored in bags throughout the house. These rags cleaned windows, wiped counters, polished furniture, and scrubbed floors with effectiveness paper could never match. Unlike paper towels used once and discarded, rags were washed and reused indefinitely, sometimes lasting years before wearing out. Children learned to reach for rags automatically, understanding that disposable products represented waste of both money and resources. The softest rags, usually from the most worn sheets, were saved for delicate tasks like cleaning eyeglasses. This practice taught that items had life cycles extending far beyond their original purpose, that creativity could give new meaning to things others considered finished. Button jars filled with salvaged buttons from worn-out clothing represented both practical supply and cherished tradition in households where replacing a single button could mean the difference between wearable and unwearable. Before any garment was thrown away or turned into rags, every button was carefully cut or snipped free and added to the family button jar. These collections grew over generations, containing buttons from great-grandmother's dresses alongside ones from children's outgrown shirts. When a button popped off, the jar was searched for a suitable replacement, and finding an exact match was celebrated like small victory. Children spent rainy afternoons sorting buttons by color, size, and material, learning patience and observation skills. The jars themselves became family heirlooms, their contents telling stories of clothing worn by ancestors long gone. This practice connected mending to memory, making the simple act of replacing a button feel like conversation with family history. Tin can storage organized workshops, kitchens, and craft rooms in homes where buying containers seemed foolish when perfectly good ones arrived free with every food purchase. Coffee cans held nails, screws, and bolts sorted by size in garage workshops. Soup cans stored pencils, crayons, and paintbrushes in children's rooms. Vegetable cans with their lids removed became planters for kitchen windowsill herbs. The cans were sometimes painted or covered with fabric to make them more attractive, but often they were used plain, their labels becoming familiar markers of what each contained. Families understood that the container itself had value beyond holding its original contents, that buying storage solutions when free ones existed represented waste. Children grew up surrounded by repurposed cans, learning to see potential in objects before discarding them. This practice created organized spaces from salvaged materials, proving that tidiness and frugality could work together. Homemade paste from flour and water replaced store-bought glue for school projects, crafts, and household repairs in kitchens where children's needs met family budgets. The recipe was simple: flour mixed with water, heated gently while stirring until it thickened into smooth paste. The mixture dried clear and held paper, cardboard, and light fabric together effectively for most household purposes. Children used it for school projects, scrapbooks, and paper crafts, while adults employed it for wallpaper repairs and bookbinding emergencies. The paste had to be used fresh or stored in refrigerators to prevent mold, teaching children about preservation and planning. Families kept flour for cooking anyway, so the paste cost essentially nothing beyond the few minutes needed to make it. This practice demonstrated that solutions existed within resources already owned, that ingenuity could fill gaps that money left empty. The paste represented kitchen wisdom applied to problems outside the kitchen. Mayonnaise jar lids became templates and tools for countless household tasks in homes where specific implements were luxuries that couldn't always be afforded. The circular lids served as cookie cutters, biscuit cutters, and dumpling guides in kitchens lacking proper baking tools. In craft rooms, they became perfect circles for tracing, templates for cutting fabric, and molds for homemade ornaments. Workshop use included measuring openings, marking holes for drilling, and serving as small parts trays during repairs. The lids came in multiple sizes depending on the original jar, providing options for different needs. Families washed and saved them automatically, adding to collections stored in drawers and cabinets throughout the house. Children learned to look at everyday items for their potential secondary uses, developing creativity that served them throughout life. This simple practice of saving jar lids represented broader wisdom about seeing value where others saw only trash. Worn towels cut into washcloths extended their usefulness in bathrooms where buying new linens meant sacrificing something else in tight family budgets. When bath towels developed holes or thin spots, they were cut into smaller squares that served perfectly well as washcloths and cleaning rags. The fabric was already soft from years of washing, making it gentler on skin than stiff new cloths. Families would get years more use from towels this way, rotating through different sizes as the fabric continued to wear. The practice required simple sewing skills to hem edges and prevent fraying, teaching children basic needlework alongside lessons about extending value. These homemade washcloths cleaned just as effectively as store-bought ones, proving that function mattered more than appearance. The progression from towel to washcloth to rag to finally discarding represented the full life cycle of fabric in frugal households where nothing was wasted until truly worn out. Aluminum foil washed and reused covered dishes, lined pans, and wrapped leftovers multiple times before finally being discarded in kitchens where even small savings mattered. After each use, the foil was carefully smoothed flat, wiped clean with a damp cloth, and folded for storage in kitchen drawers. Families might reuse a single sheet of foil a dozen times before it became too torn or brittle to function properly. Children learned to handle foil gently, understanding that careless tearing meant waste the family couldn't afford. The practice extended to aluminum pie plates, which were washed after each use and stored for future baking projects. This careful stewardship of aluminum products reflected broader attitudes about materials and consumption, the understanding that everything had value beyond single use. Foil represented modern convenience, but poor families adapted it to traditional thrift, making space-age materials serve old-fashioned values of conservation and care. Plastic bread bags became food storage, lunch sacks, and protective coverings in households where buying plastic wrap and storage bags seemed like unnecessary expense. The bags were turned inside out, wiped clean, and hung to dry on cabinet knobs or clotheslines before being folded and stored for reuse. Families used them to wrap sandwiches, store vegetables in refrigerators, cover bowls of rising dough, and protect shoes during muddy weather. Children carried lunches to school in bread bags, sometimes embarrassed but learning that function mattered more than appearance. The bags also served as makeshift gloves for messy tasks like greasing pans or handling raw meat. This practice required attention to cleanliness and organization, teaching children systems for managing household resources. Bread bags represented the intersection of modern packaging and traditional thrift, proof that new materials could serve old values of conservation and reuse. Grease pencil marks on measuring cups replaced worn-off measurement lines in kitchens where buying new equipment wasn't an option when the old still functioned. When printed measurements faded from years of washing, mothers would carefully remark the lines using grease pencils or nail polish that could withstand repeated scrubbing. The practice extended to mixing bowls, storage containers, and any kitchen tool where measurements mattered for consistent cooking results. Families understood that accuracy in baking especially required clear measurements, and replacing tools just because markings faded seemed wasteful when simple solutions existed. Children watched this careful maintenance and learned that taking care of possessions extended their usefulness indefinitely. The remarked cups might look homemade and slightly messy, but they functioned perfectly well for families who valued practicality over appearance. This small act of repair represented larger values about stewardship and resourcefulness. String saved from packages and tied into balls provided household twine for countless purposes in homes where buying new string seemed foolish when perfectly good string arrived free. Every package that entered the house was carefully unwrapped, and the string was wound onto growing balls kept in kitchen drawers or utility closets. This string tied newspaper bundles for recycling, secured plants to stakes in gardens, wrapped packages for mailing, and performed hundreds of small tasks that required something to bind or hold. Children learned to untie knots patiently rather than cutting, understanding that preserving string length mattered. The balls grew surprisingly large over months of saving, representing accumulated patience and attention to detail. String balls connected families to older generations who had practiced the same thrift, making the simple act of saving string feel like participation in tradition that stretched back through time. Wire hangers bent into tools solved problems throughout poor households where specialized implements were luxuries that couldn't always be justified. Straightened hangers became drain uncloggers, reaching deep into pipes to pull out clogs that would otherwise require expensive plumber visits. Bent into hooks, they retrieved items fallen behind heavy furniture or into narrow spaces. Shaped into loops, they created bubble wands for children's entertainment and plant supports for garden vegetables. The wire was strong enough for real work, yet flexible enough for shaping by hand. Families kept collections of hangers specifically designated for tool making, separate from those still used for clothing. Children learned basic metalworking skills, bending hangers into useful shapes, developing problem-solving abilities that served them throughout life. The humble wire hanger represented resourcefulness at its most creative, transforming ordinary objects into solutions for extraordinary problems. Coffee cans with plastic lids became the universal storage solution for everything from bacon grease to nuts and bolts in households where buying proper containers seemed wasteful. The cans were sturdy, stackable, and came with reusable lids that sealed contents against moisture and pests. Kitchens used them for storing flour, sugar, cookies, and leftovers. Workshops organized hardware into labeled cans that lined shelves in neat rows. Children's rooms held crayons, marbles, and small toys in cans decorated with construction paper. The familiar red and blue cans became so ubiquitous that families joked about their coffee can collections outnumbering their actual coffee consumption. This practice demonstrated how commercial packaging could serve household needs far beyond original purposes. Coffee cans represented the philosophy that containers themselves held value, that proper storage solutions existed within products already purchased for other reasons. Worn socks, stuffed with other worn socks, became draft stoppers placed along windowsills and door bottoms to block cold air from entering poorly insulated homes. When socks developed holes too large for darning, they were saved rather than discarded, accumulating until enough existed for stuffing projects. The filled sock tubes were laid against drafty gaps, providing surprisingly effective insulation that kept heating costs down during harsh winters. Children often helped with stuffing, learning that even clothing too worn for wearing still had value and purpose. The draft stoppers could be moved throughout the house as needed, following cold air wherever it crept inside. This practice connected textile recycling to home maintenance, showing how problems could be solved by combining scraps others would have thrown away. Sock draft stoppers represented creative problem-solving using only materials already owned. Oatmeal boxes became storage containers, craft supplies, and even musical instruments in households where cylindrical containers were too useful to discard after their original contents were consumed. The round cardboard boxes stored everything from spaghetti to knitting needles to small toys that needed containing. Covered with fabric or contact paper, they became attractive canisters that lined kitchen counters and pantry shelves. Children turned them into drums, covered the ends with wax paper or fabric stretched tight, and secured with rubber bands to create surprisingly resonant instruments. The boxes also served as molds for homemade candles, planters for starting seeds, and organizers for desk supplies. Families accumulated collections of different sizes, finding new uses long after the oatmeal was eaten. This practice taught children to see potential in everyday objects, developing creativity that transformed packaging into tools, toys, and functional household items. Vegetable scraps simmered into broth, turned kitchen waste into flavorful cooking liquid in households where buying canned broth seemed extravagant when free ingredients went into garbage daily. Onion skins, celery leaves, carrot tops, and potato peels were collected in bags stored in freezers until enough accumulated for broth making. The scraps were covered with water and simmered for hours, extracting every bit of flavor and nutrition before being strained and discarded. The resulting broth formed the base for soups, gravies, and rice dishes, adding depth that plain water could never provide. Families understood that flavor existed in parts others threw away, that attention and effort could transform waste into something valuable. Children watched this process and learned that food had value beyond its obvious edible portions. Vegetable scrap broth represented the ultimate expression of kitchen thrift, creating something from nothing. Worn blankets layered under fitted sheets added warmth and cushioning to beds in homes where buying mattress pads represented expense that couldn't be justified when alternatives existed. When blankets became too thin or tattered for use as top covers, They were repurposed as mattress protectors, spread flat beneath bottom sheets where their appearance didn't matter. The layers added insulation from cold mattresses during winter and provided extra cushioning for comfort throughout the year. Families stacked multiple worn blankets over time, creating beds that felt increasingly plush despite containing only discarded textiles. Children slept warmer and more comfortably because of this hidden layer of recycled warmth. The practice extended blanket usefulness by years, delaying the need for new bedding purchases indefinitely. This trick represented the philosophy that comfort and thrift could coexist, that worn items could serve new purposes invisible to anyone outside the household. Saving and reusing bacon grease in ceramic crocks beside the stove was standard kitchen practice that modernization nearly eliminated. Food writers and health advocates condemned the habit as unsanitary and unhealthy, promoting spray oils and margarine as cleaner alternatives. Bacon fat contains roughly 40% saturated fat, but also 45% monounsaturated oleic acid, the same compound that gives olive oil its health halo. The rendered fat proved remarkably stable, resisting oxidation that makes polyunsaturated vegetable oils go rancid and potentially harmful. Using bacon grease for frying eggs, seasoning beans, or starting gravies added depth of flavor no industrial product could match. The practice eliminated waste, stretched food budgets, and delivered genuine taste that made simple meals memorable. Families who never threw away bacon drippings were practicing sustainable cooking that modern chefs now celebrate. Using vinegar to tenderize meat was how mountain families transformed tough cuts into something approaching luxury without spending money they did not have available. A few splashes of apple cider vinegar added to the marinade broke down tough muscle fibers in wild game and older livestock that would otherwise require hours of cooking. Families made their own vinegar from apple scraps, so the ingredient cost nothing beyond initial effort. The acid worked slowly overnight, penetrating deep into meat while adding subtle tanginess that complemented strong flavors of venison, squirrel, and tough old roosters. Women learned exact proportions through generations of practice, knowing how much was enough to tenderize without making meat mushy. The marinated meat could then be fried, roasted, or stewed with significantly shorter cooking times. This trick made poor cuts taste like quality and stretched limited protein into satisfying meals. Bacon grease canister systems turned breakfast byproduct into the most versatile cooking ingredient in elderly kitchens. A dedicated container sat permanently on the back of the stove, receiving rendered fat from every strip of bacon cooked throughout the week. This grease became primary cooking fat for everything: frying eggs, seasoning vegetables, making gravy. Seniors understood that buying separate oils and fats was wasteful when breakfast already provided perfectly good cooking medium. The grease imparted subtle smokiness while eliminating need for multiple expensive pantry items. For elderly widows who once cooked for large families, adjusting to small portions meant bacon lasted longer, and grease accumulated steadily enough to eliminate separate fat purchases entirely. The canister represented accumulated value, visible wealth measured in tablespoons of pure flavor waiting to transform simple ingredients into satisfying meals. Before cling film and plastic containers became common, Grandma had a clever way to keep leftover meat fresh and tasty by wrapping it carefully in wax paper. This old-fashioned technique helped preserve moisture while allowing the meat to breathe just enough to prevent it from becoming soggy or spoiled quickly. Wax paper was widely available and easy to use, making it the perfect solution for storing cold cuts, roasted pieces, or cooked meats. By wrapping leftovers this way, she extended their shelf life in the fridge, reducing waste and ensuring that every bit could be enjoyed again. The gentle barrier protected food from drying out while preventing odors from mixing with other items. This simple yet effective preservation trick was especially important in days when refrigeration was less advanced or less common. Today, it is easy to forget how much thought went into keeping food fresh without modern conveniences. Revisiting this method reminds us of a time when resourcefulness was key in the kitchen and every meal counted. It is a timeless technique worth rediscovering for those who appreciate both tradition and practicality. Rendering and cooking with lard was standard practice in the 1960s kitchens before vegetable shortening, and seed oils dominated grocery shelves. Health authorities warned families that animal fats would clog arteries, pushing them toward hydrogenated alternatives that seemed modern and clean. Decades later, scientists discovered those replacement products contained trans fats far more dangerous than anything in traditional lard. Pure lard from pastured pigs contains oleic acid, the same heart-healthy monounsaturated fat praised in olive oil, along with vitamin D that plant oils cannot provide. The smoke point proved higher than most vegetable oils, making it safer for high-heat frying without creating harmful compounds. Pie crusts made with lard achieved flakiness that shortening never matched. The generation that abandoned their grandmother's lard bucket for Crisco cans traded genuine nutrition for industrial convenience that science now regrets promoting. Soaking beans with baking soda was a trick that solved two problems at once in mountain kitchens where fuel was precious and time was always scarce for busy families. A pinch of baking soda added to soaking water softened dried beans faster by breaking down their tough outer skins, reducing cooking time by hours. For families burning wood, they had chopped themselves. Shorter cooking times meant real savings in labor and resources. The alkaline water also neutralized compounds that caused digestive discomfort, making beans easier on stomachs. Women learned exact amounts through trial and error, knowing too much soda left a soapy taste while too little made no difference. The beans soaked overnight in crocks near the warm stove, absorbing water and releasing starches. By morning, they were plump and ready, cooking to creamy softness in half the usual time. This knowledge passed quietly between neighbors as practical wisdom that made survival easier. Bread heel stockpots transformed what most people discarded into the foundation of countless meals for elderly cooks living alone. Every bread heel, every stale crust was saved in cloth bags hung near warm stoves where they continued drying without molding. When enough accumulated, seniors simmered them with vegetable scraps and bones into thick, nutritious bases that became soup, gravy, or bread pudding. This wasn't poverty cooking. It was wisdom from generations who understood waste was the enemy of survival. The bread absorbed flavors and released starches that thickened broths naturally without expensive cream. Seniors living alone had no one to share large loaves with, meaning bread went stale faster. Rather than watching money grow mold, these clever cooks developed systems turning inevitable staleness into culinary advantage, creating meals that tasted intentional rather than desperate. Grandma's kitchen was a treasure trove of simple yet clever tricks, and using potato water to thicken soups was one of her favorites. Instead of reaching for flour or cream, she would save the water left over from boiling potatoes, which contained natural starches that added a smooth texture and subtle richness to her broths. This method was especially useful during times when ingredients were scarce or rationed, allowing her to stretch soups further without sacrificing flavor or consistency. The potato water also had a mild taste that did not overpower the dish, making it an ideal thickener for both vegetable and meat soups. This resourceful approach not only kept meals hearty, but also showcased her ability to use every bit of the ingredients at hand. It was a simple reminder that great cooking did not always require fancy additions, just a little knowledge passed down through generations. Modern cooks often overlook this practical tip, but revisiting it can bring a nostalgic touch and a boost of homey comfort to any soup. It is one of those forgotten secrets that can elevate everyday meals without extra cost or fuss. Simmering bones for hours to make rich broth seemed wasteful to efficiency-minded 1960s homemakers being sold canned alternatives. Campbell's and other manufacturers promised convenience while dismissing homemade stock as unnecessary labor. Modern nutrition research has vindicated the old ways, revealing that bone broth delivers collagen, glycine, and minerals in bioavailable forms that support gut health, joint function, and skin elasticity. The gelatin released during long simmering creates protein structures that help heal intestinal lining damaged by processed foods. Glucosamine extracted naturally from cartilage provides joint support without expensive supplements. Grandmothers who refused to throw away chicken carcasses or beef bones weren't being cheap. They were practicing nutritional wisdom that pharmaceutical companies now bottle and sell for premium prices. The stockpot simmering on the back burner represented genuine wealth that no convenience product could replicate. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Egg water fertilizer recycling was a trick elderly gardeners used to stretch both breakfast ingredients and garden productivity simultaneously. After boiling eggs, seniors saved the calcium-rich cooking water and let it cool before pouring it around tomato plants and peppers. The water contained minerals leached from eggshells that prevented blossom end rot and strengthened plant cell walls. This closed-loop system meant breakfast contributed directly to dinner months later. Elderly gardeners living alone often struggled to maintain large plots, so maximizing every resource mattered enormously. The egg water trick required no additional expense, no trips to garden centers, no heavy fertilizer bags to wrestle. It was invisible efficiency producing visible results in stronger plants and better harvests, connecting the kitchen sink directly to next season's food supply in ways modern seniors have completely forgotten. Drinking whole milk and eating full-fat dairy products was common practice before low-fat recommendations transformed the dairy case into a parade of skim and reduced-fat options. Parents were told that removing fat would make dairy healthier for growing children and weight-conscious adults. Decades of research now show that full-fat dairy consumers have lower rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease compared to those choosing reduced-fat alternatives. The natural fats in whole milk slow sugar absorption, provide fat-soluble vitamins in bioavailable forms, and signal satiety that prevents overeating. Removing fat concentrated the lactose sugar while eliminating the components that made dairy genuinely nourishing. Children raised on whole milk from the family cow or local dairy received complete nutrition that skim milk simply cannot provide. The fat phobia that transformed American dairy consumption may have contributed to the very health problems it claimed to prevent. Greasing cast iron with fatback was the secret behind every properly seasoned skillet in rural Appalachian kitchens across the Mountain South. Fatback, the thick layer of fat from a hog's back, was rubbed across cast iron cookware while still warm, creating a protective coating that prevented rust and built the non-stick surface that made mountain cooking possible. Women saved every scrap specifically for this purpose, keeping pieces wrapped in cloth near the stove where they stayed soft and ready to use. The process was repeated after every use, building layers of seasoning that turned cheap cast iron into family heirlooms passed through generations. A well-seasoned skillet required no additional oil for frying and released food effortlessly. Children learned this ritual by watching mothers perform it hundreds of times before being trusted with precious cookware. This simple trick transformed basic equipment into tools that lasted lifetimes and cooked food with unmatched quality. Windowsill refrigeration extended food preservation for seniors who lacked electric refrigerators or couldn't afford running them constantly. During cold months, a shelf installed outside kitchen windows became natural cold storage where butter stayed firm, milk remained fresh, and leftovers kept safely for days. Elderly cooks positioned these shelves on north sides where sun never warmed them, many installing small wooden boxes with screen ventilation keeping pests away while allowing cold air circulation. This technique saved substantial electricity during winter when heating bills already strained budgets. Seniors in older homes without modern refrigerators relied entirely on this method, timing shopping to cooler seasons and cooking to accommodate natural refrigeration. The windowsill shelf represented independence. Proof seniors could feed themselves safely without expensive appliances or help from family members who worried constantly. Grandma's baking always had a special touch, and one secret she swore by was adding a pinch of salt to sweet-baked goods. This tiny addition worked wonders by balancing the sweetness and enhancing the overall flavor profile of cakes, cookies, and pies. Salt brings out the natural taste of other ingredients, preventing desserts from becoming flat or overly sugary. This subtle technique helped her recipes stand out, making each bite more complex and satisfying. The pinch of salt also softened harsh edges in overly sweet recipes, creating a more rounded flavor. It was an easy step, but one that made a noticeable difference, especially when working with simple ingredients. Passed down through generations, this baking hack remains a classic for anyone looking to elevate their homemade treats. Modern cooks might skip it, but incorporating this forgotten trick can bring a nostalgic depth and warmth to sweets. It is a small detail that transforms ordinary recipes into memorable comfort foods. Remembering this tip is a way to honor Grandma's careful approach to flavor and her love for baking. Home fermentation of vegetables was actively discouraged by food safety authorities during the 1960s, who warned families about botulism from homemade pickles and sauerkraut. Store-bought versions pasteurized with vinegar seemed safer and more reliable. Scientists now understand that traditional lactofermentation creates conditions where beneficial bacteria thrive while harmful pathogens cannot survive, producing probiotics that support immune function and digestive health in ways pasteurized products never can. The process preserved vegetables through winter while actually increasing their nutritional value, creating vitamins absent from fresh produce. Fermented foods populated the gut with diverse microorganisms now recognized as essential for mental health and weight regulation. Families who maintained crocks of fermenting cabbage weren't risking their health. They were cultivating living foods that modern probiotic supplements attempt to replicate at far greater expense. Storing eggs in water glass was the preservation method that kept mountain families supplied through winter months when hens stopped laying entirely and eggs became scarce. Water glass, a solution of sodium silicate and water, sealed eggshells by filling their tiny pores and preventing air and bacteria from entering. Fresh eggs were carefully lowered into crocks filled with the solution, where they remained edible for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. Families gathered eggs during peak laying season and preserved dozens at a time, ensuring protein through lean months. The technique required clean eggs with intact shells, so women handled each one carefully, rejecting any with cracks that might introduce contamination. Eggs preserved this way cooked normally, though they sometimes produced flatter whites, which mattered little when food security was the priority. The crocks were stored in cool cellars where temperatures stayed stable. Thermos cooking allowed elderly cooks to prepare hot meals without standing over dangerous stoves or running expensive burners for hours. The technique involved bringing ingredients to a boil, then immediately transferring everything into preheated wide-mouth thermos containers where retained heat continued cooking. Oatmeal prepared at bedtime emerged perfectly cooked by morning. Tough bean soups started after breakfast finished themselves by dinner time. For seniors with arthritis, memory concerns, or simple exhaustion, thermos cooking eliminated dangers of forgotten burners and physical demands of stirring for extended periods. The method saved enormous fuel amounts during eras when heating costs consumed significant portions of fixed incomes. Seniors discovered many dishes actually tasted better when cooked this gentle, slow way, as flavors developed without harsh temperatures that could toughen proteins or burn sugars. Adding generous amounts of butter or bacon fat to vegetables was considered nutritional sabotage during the low-fat obsession emerging in the 1960s. Health experts insisted vegetables should be steamed plain or eaten raw to maximize their benefits. Research now confirms that fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K require dietary fat for proper absorption, meaning naked vegetables deliver far less nutrition than those prepared with traditional fats. Carotenoids in carrots, lycopene in tomatoes, and other crucial compounds pass through the digestive system largely unutilized without accompanying fat. Grandmothers who fried green beans in bacon drippings or sautéed spinach in butter weren't ruining healthy food. They were dramatically increasing its nutritional availability. The practice also made vegetables palatable enough that children actually ate them willingly. Science now recommends exactly what common sense already knew. Some fat makes everything about vegetables work better. Wrapping food in wet newspaper before burying it in coals was a technique that created steam cooking without any equipment at all beyond what most families had available. The dampened paper protected food from direct contact with ash, while moisture trapped inside created pressure that cooked fish and vegetables evenly throughout. Mountain families learned this from Native American traditions and adapted it to their own needs, using whatever paper was available from rare newspapers to catalog pages. The paper charred on the outside while food inside steamed to perfection, emerging clean and thoroughly cooked. Timing was crucial because too long meant paper burned through while too short left food underdone. Experienced cooks developed instinct for judging coals and thickness. The technique worked especially well for delicate fish that fell apart when fried, keeping flesh intact while infusing subtle smoke flavor. Children watched this magic happen at fish fries. Haybox cooking was an insulation method seniors used to finish slow-cooked dishes without consuming any additional fuel after initial heating on the stovetop. A wooden box lined with hay, old blankets, or crumpled newspapers held covered pots of just boiled stew or beans, maintaining temperatures high enough to continue cooking for several hours without supervision. Seniors started dishes on the stove each morning, brought them to full boil, then transferred everything to hay boxes before leaving for church, medical appointments, or afternoon rest. When they returned hours later, dinner had finished itself using only heat already paid for during that initial boiling. This technique stretched fuel budgets enormously during eras when coal, wood, or gas represented significant monthly expenses for elderly people surviving on fixed incomes. The hay box also eliminated fire hazards from unattended stoves, crucial safety for seniors living alone. Eating liver, kidneys, and other organ meats weekly was routine in the 1960s households before factory farming and supermarket convenience made such foods seem primitive. Muscle meats became the only acceptable protein while organs were relegated to pet food. Nutritional science now recognizes organ meats as the most nutrient-dense foods available, containing concentrated vitamins and minerals that muscle tissue cannot provide. Liver alone delivers more vitamin A, B12, folate, copper, and iron per ounce than any other food, supporting energy production and preventing deficiencies affecting millions today. Heart provides CoQ10 essential for cellular energy. Kidneys offer selenium and B vitamins in exceptional quantities. The generation that regularly consumed these foods experienced fewer deficiency-related health problems, despite having less access to supplements. What seemed like poverty eating was actually nutritional abundance that affluence foolishly abandoned. Burying potatoes in ash was one of the oldest cooking methods mountain families used before electric ovens existed in rural Appalachian communities. Fresh potatoes were nestled directly into warm ashes at the edge of a fireplace, covered completely until only coals surrounded them on all sides. The ash acted as insulation, slowly roasting potatoes over several hours until skins turned papery and insides became fluffy and sweet. Families learned exactly how deep to bury them through years of practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The technique required no pots, no pans, and no fuel beyond what was already heating the home. Children were sent to check potatoes by poking them with sticks, learning doneness through texture rather than timers. The finished potatoes emerged with subtle smokiness no modern oven could replicate. This method fed families through winters when other cooking options were limited and fuel was precious. One-pot cooking on wood stoves was a survival strategy that seniors perfected long before modern slow cookers existed. Elderly widows understood that managing multiple pots on temperamental wood stoves wasted precious fuel and required constant attention. Instead, they layered ingredients in a single heavy pot, dense root vegetables at the bottom where heat concentrated, meat in the middle, quick-cooking greens on top. The pot sat at the back of the stove, simmering all afternoon while they rested. This method stretched small amounts of meat across entire weeks while keeping kitchens warm during winter. The flavors melded together in ways modern separated cooking cannot replicate. For seniors counting every piece of coal or stick of firewood, one-pot cooking wasn't just convenient. It was essential to stretching fixed incomes through harsh winters when heating and eating competed for the same limited resources. Heavy salting of meat for preservation was abandoned when refrigeration became universal, and health authorities began warning about sodium consumption. The practice seemed unnecessary when freezers could preserve food indefinitely without additives. Yet salt curing did far more than prevent spoilage. It created beneficial compounds, developed complex flavors, and improved the nutritional profile of preserved meats in ways freezing never could. The curing process encouraged beneficial bacteria while inhibiting pathogens, creating fermented products with probiotic potential. Salt-preserved meats developed concentrated flavors, requiring smaller portions to satisfy, potentially reducing overall consumption. Traditional hams and bacons prepared with proper salt curing contained enzymes and compounds that modern quick-cured versions lack entirely. The craft of salt preservation represented accumulated wisdom about food chemistry that industrial shortcuts eliminated while claiming improvement. Using coffee grounds for scrubbing pots was how mountain women kept cast iron and heavy cookware clean without wasting precious soap. The coarse texture of spent grounds provided gentle abrasion that lifted stuck-on food and grease without scratching seasoned surfaces that had taken years to build. Women collected grounds after brewing, keeping them in a tin near the wash basin where they stayed slightly damp and ready for use. The natural oils in coffee also helped condition cast iron while cleaning, maintaining the protective layer that prevented rust. This method cost nothing since the grounds would otherwise be discarded, embodying the waste-nothing philosophy that defined mountain households. Children learned to scrub pots this way before being trusted with more delicate dishes. The faint coffee smell that lingered on clean cookware became associated with spotless kitchens. This trick worked so well that many families never purchased commercial scouring products. Coffee grounds. Gardening applications stretched breakfast investments into vegetable production for elderly gardeners maintaining small plots. Used grounds were spread around acid-loving plants like blueberries and azaleas, worked into compost piles as nitrogen-rich amendments, and sprinkled around plant bases to deter slugs. For seniors drinking coffee daily, this created continuous garden fertilizer costing nothing additional. The grounds improved soil structure, attracted beneficial earthworms, and provided slow-release nutrients that expensive commercial fertilizers couldn't match for value. Elderly gardeners understood self-sufficiency required connecting every household activity to food production whenever possible. The coffee grounds trick required minimal effort, simply collecting and distributing material otherwise filling trash cans, while providing genuine benefits, reducing fertilizer purchases and improving harvests for seniors growing significant portions of their own food. Fermenting foods without commercial starters or precise temperature control seemed reckless to food scientists promoting standardized production during the 1960s. Wild fermentation relied on naturally occurring bacteria and yeasts that authorities viewed as unpredictable and dangerous. Traditional fermenters understood that proper salt concentration, anaerobic conditions, and patience created environments where beneficial organisms outcompeted harmful ones without external intervention. The resulting diversity of probiotic strains far exceeded anything commercial starters could provide, creating products with complex flavors and genuine health benefits. Sourdough bread made from wild-captured yeasts offered superior nutrition compared to commercial yeast versions. Naturally fermented pickles and sauerkraut contained living cultures that pasteurized products couldn't match. The wisdom embedded in traditional fermentation practices predated scientific understanding but achieved what laboratory methods later struggled to replicate. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the buttercrock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Citrus peel preservation systems transformed garbage into valuable flavoring that elevated simple dishes without additional cost. Elderly cooks saved every orange peel, lemon rind, and grapefruit skin, drying them on warming ovens or windowsills until completely desiccated. These dried peels were stored in jars, ready to be grated into baked goods, simmered into teas, or added to stews for brightness fresh citrus couldn't provide when out of season or too expensive. For seniors who received oranges as rare holiday gifts, the peels represented weeks of additional flavoring long after fruit was eaten. The drying process concentrated essential oils while preventing spoilage, creating shelf-stable ingredients from what visitors considered garbage. This preservation mentality, seeing value in every component of purchased food, defined elderly cooking during eras when discarding edible material felt genuinely wasteful. Smoking meat in the chimney was how mountain families preserved pork, game, and fish, using smoke from fires they were already burning for warmth and cooking. Hooks or racks installed inside chimneys held meat in the rising smoke stream, which dried and flavored the flesh while depositing preservative compounds that prevented spoilage. The technique required careful attention because too much heat cooked the meat while too little failed to preserve it, so families positioned racks at exactly the right height. Different woods produced different flavors, with hickory and apple being prized while pine was avoided for its resinous taste. The process took days or weeks depending on the size of cuts, with someone checking regularly to ensure even smoking. Meat preserved this way lasted through entire winters without refrigeration, providing essential protein. The chimney served double duty, heating the home while preparing food for storage throughout the winter months. Which strange household trick did your family swear by? Drop your memory in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe so we can keep uncovering the forgotten wisdom that kept families going through hard times.